Now, again, an honor to introduce Erik Havig. I've known Erik since I got here back in 2016. Great guy, and again, he always says yes when I ask him to help out with these things, so I do appreciate that, Erik. Erik is the executive manager with ODOT's planning section, and he's here to talk about planning. Now, we don't have a lot of time planning, and we could probably talk about planning for a day, maybe longer, right? No. So anyway, I give you Erik Havig.
Thank you. I know you've already been going for a little while. Before I get going, I already had one request. Let's take a couple seconds, stand up, stretch your legs, raise your arms above your head, make sure blood is flowing. This way, at least when I talk about planning, you're going to be really interested and not fall asleep during the discussion. So thank you. Okay. Hopefully everything is still working, body parts are still moving, blood's flowing. We'll get into linking planning with project delivery. And Diane, thank you for the great words. We could probably really talk about this for an entire session if we wanted to. But I'm going to try to focus on a couple of key areas around linking planning and project delivery and really understanding what are some of the risks if we don't understand what's coming from plans, from our local government partners, into the project delivery process. There's a lot of risks that can happen. However, the joke earlier about engineers and the trying to be an introvert and extrovert, I am an engineer as well, so I'm an engineer that got into planning. If you want to grab me after the session, we could talk about how the heck that happens. So I also believe in some engineering principles. We need to have a foundation to understand what planning is, to understand how these risks can really come into play. So I'm going to talk a little bit about building that foundation of what kind of plans we have out there, where projects come from, so we understand what those risks might be moving forward. So transportation planning, again, you're probably going to see this racetrack so many times. If you don't have it ingrained in your brain, it'll make a lot of sense at the end. So transportation planning starts at number one. Hey, we're at the beginning. We're the first speakers, right? So transportation planning leads us all the way up into the STIP development phase, and I know we have our STIP table. A couple of folks here, I can see our STIP table. There we are. That's really what happens to begin the project. Projects begin through the planning phase for the most part. So what is transportation planning? Transportation planning consists really of two planning focus areas. One is statewide policy plans, and the other is transportation system plans. So statewide policy plans. What are the statewide policy plans? Statewide policy plans are made up of the long-range Oregon Transportation Plan and the modal and topic plans that are underneath those. So federal rules, state laws and requirements require all state departments of transportation to develop and maintain a long-range transportation plan. Now, the difference between state rules and federal rules are slight in difference, and I'm not going to get into that. If you really want to talk about that, again, grab me in the back. But we have to have a long-range plan. So the Oregon Transportation Plan constitutes our long-range transportation plan. The OTP sets the vision. What is the vision we have for the state for transportation? What is the overall prioritization we want to talk about for investing our limited dollars? We don't have enough money to do everything we'd like to do. That'd be great if we did, but we don't. So we have to prioritize. There are projects that get selected. There's projects that don't get selected. Why do those that rise to the top get selected? These statewide policy plans help to set that framework for why certain investments are made and why certain investments maybe are deferred. So the OTP is very high level. It does not get into projects. It talks about what do we want to achieve from a global perspective only. But it also doesn't even get into very much detail around specific modal topics. So underneath the OTP, we have a series of modal and subject matter kind of topics, topical plans. So the Oregon Highway Plan, Oregon Bicycle Pedestrian Plan, the Oregon Transportation Options Plan, Public Transportation Plan. I say the real reason for this is we want to make sure that planners have a continuous job moving forward, so the more plans we have, we can have them covered. But we can see there's a lot of documents here. The key takeaway is under Oregon's land use laws, when we adopt, or the Oregon Transportation Commission adopts per state law, the Oregon Transportation Plan and the mode and topic plans, these become land use documents in our land use system. Oregon's land use system is very strong. It was built back in 1971, but basically it means that we have to make sure that the transportation investments, when we put something into the system, it is complying with these statewide policy plans. We have to be consistent. They don't just sit out here because we want to have them and then we go off and do whatever we want. Our projects need to be consistent. So that's going to be a theme I'll come back to, because if we don't, it can create all sorts of problems. So I covered a lot of these things, a couple of additional things, not just the statewide policy and investments. Performance measures and targets. Now at a federal level and a statewide level, we have to achieve certain outcomes in the system. So how do we do that? How do we measure those? How do we make sure our projects are going to yield the results that we have to demonstrate to our federal partners, our state partners? And I can tell you right now, the Oregon legislature is really starting to look at this about what do we get for our investment dollars, and then what kind of outcomes and goals we want to get to. So the other category of transportation planning is what we call transportation system plans. So the policy plan is very high level. Transportation system plans, we now start to bring things down a little bit more towards the ground. Maybe not on the ground, but maybe only about 1,000 feet versus 30,000 feet. And here's some examples of what we have. Transportation system plans. These are required by all local governments in Oregon, cities, counties, all have to have a transportation system plan. If you are a metropolitan planning organization, an MPO, these are federal creatures. If you are over 50,000 in population, you have to have a regional transportation plan. We also develop what we call facility plans for some of ODOT's facilities, so state highways primarily, but we can also do it for other ODOT facilities. Interchange area management plans, you may have heard of those, facility plans, corridor plans, refinement plans. All of those might be other detailed planning documents that can inform projects and project delivery. Another key aspect, these again are adopted either at the state or local level, which makes them a land use document in Oregon's land use system. So that's again a very important factor. So we got to be the consistency message all the way through. So transportation system plans, why should you care? This is where a lot of the investment types of projects really will come from, and I'll talk a little bit more about this. But the system plans start to define what are the actual transportation needs. What's the system? What's the vision for that system on the ground within each community, within each county, within each MPO area? It does identify specific kind of project solutions. Now, it doesn't say exactly how to build those or too many details of the design, but it talks about it in a general nature. So it may say, I need an intersection improvement to accomplish this, but it doesn't say if it's a signal or a roundabout necessarily. Sets the community and OTC expectations. If you don't have built-in expectations with your local government partners, and we come in and we try to do a project within their community and we're not on the same page, I guarantee you're going to have problems, and the TSPs and RTPs help to set that. And again, we got to be consistent. So where do all these projects come from that you get to work on and design and build eventually, hopefully? A couple of different things. The first one is management systems. Management systems are actually part of the planning process. This is where we take in a lot of data for our asset conditions, and we try to predict how they're going to perform, where they're performing well, where do we need to invest. So pavement, bridge, culverts, safety management systems, even the SPIS system, Safety Priority Index system, is a type of a management system that helps inform where do we have problems on the system and where do we need to invest. Since our STIP is primarily, is it 90 or 95% towards the fix-it side right now, this is where a lot of our projects are going to be coming from, is from our management systems. The rest of the projects really come from some form of system planning activity. Most of it's focused on highway modernization, safety, or operations kind of projects. We have not had a lot of money for major modernization, and the money we have had, I think since about 2001, has come from legislative earmarks. But we used to have a day where our area commissions on transportation focused on what are the most kind of important modernization projects we need to do, and where do they come from? So system plans help form that. Transportation system plans don't get into the details of state of good repair. So I just talked about those management systems. TSPs simply have policy language that says these are good investments to make. We got to make sure our pavement is good quality, our bridges can handle the types of traffic and the freight that needs to cross them. We need to make sure culverts are running so our roads don't wash out. So they support good state of good repair just through a policy framework, but they don't list out specific projects or investments. And then again, we address all modes of transportation as part of a TSP. So if you open up any TSP that's been done in the last probably 5 or 10 years, I'll guarantee there's more information on there for bike and ped transportation investments than there probably is for highway investments. There's been a lot of work around how do we make sure walking, biking, and transit is better integrated into our planning. So again, system plans establish the project parameters, goals, and objectives. They do include a list of projects when we're talking about specific modernization, operations, and sometimes safety. And again, project designs must be consistent with the system plan. So if the system plan calls for a specific type of solution, we're going to have to be consistent with that, or we could run into some challenges and problems. So how and when should you interact with planning as you're working on developing your project? The first phase is right at the beginning. If we can communicate at the beginning, less problems will likely happen as we develop those projects. So the initial business case is we're out prior to the STIP even getting going. The project managers, the program owners are coming up with their 150 or 200% lists of potential projects. This is the time to sit down with your planning group in your region and talk about, is there anything in the system planning or in our management systems or with our metropolitan areas we need to understand before we even start to scope that project, so we build that into it at the beginning. You don't want to come into the project at the DAP phase and say, whoops, we forgot something. That's going to be a major issue for you. Scoping, even as we're out on the ground, desk scoping or field scoping, this is another opportunity to sit down with your planning staff to make sure you've connected the dots around what might happen, what do we need to think about. Primarily, we're not there from the technical side. We're going to help you understand what are the political ramifications, where's our local governments at, what do they need to make sure these projects are going to achieve. There's a lot of conversations that go on in the planning process to build buy-in for types of solutions. And when you have that level of commitment and support and build that level of trust with your local governments, it's really critical that we make sure that that information is factored into the scoping of the project in the beginning. Leverage discussions. So this is also a program that's fairly new in the statewide transportation improvement program out of the STIP. We've developed some buckets where we can now leverage investments with other investments where you can gain some efficiencies. This is another opportunity where we can bring some information from planning into that process to say, here's some other stuff from a system plan. While we're out here doing this pavement preservation in an urban area, maybe we need to think about the walking and the biking and maybe some transit pullouts or a high capacity transit line. Maybe it's a signal prioritization that we can do for transit on the back of another project while we're already in there doing that work. How can we leverage those and find funding to make that happen? Planning can help figure those out for you. And then finally, in the final business case and into project delivery, as you're developing your project, not everything goes very smoothly. I know there's some experienced project leaders. What's the percentage of a project going exactly the way you foresaw it going when you set up your project schedule? 5%, 10%, 0%? The world happens, right? You get into it, you get into the design, you get into the issues, you start to deal with some of those challenges, you have to make adaptations. So if you have to make an adaptation and it's starting to affect some ideas or concepts from the planning process, bring your regional planning group into that. They can help facilitate those conversations with your local government partners and others to make sure that the project can still stay on schedule. So, what are all the things that can go wrong if we don't really have good coordination and communication and connection from the planning phase into that project delivery phase. So the first one is increased project timelines. So I mentioned that all of our statewide policy plans, our transportation system plans, regional plans are land use documents. What that means is they have to be in compliance with statewide planning goals and regulations, and I'm not going to bore you with what that whole list is, but there's a specific goal around transportation. We have to be in compliance with that goal, as well as about 4 or 5 others that really affect transportation. If we come up with a project solution that is not in compliance with a system plan or a statewide policy plan, we may have to enter into a goal exception process. A goal exception process can take anywhere from 6 months to 2 years to go through, depending on what kind of challenges you have, what kind of community impacts you have, and what kind of technical information do you need to get through from the Department of Justice and the legal process to approve a goal exception at the local level. So it's very critical we try to avoid goal exceptions, or if we know we need them, flag them early in the business case, the initial business case, the scoping process, so we build a schedule that has factored this process in. This is not an easy thing to get through. The next level of approval or change is called a plan amendment. These can happen at both the state level or at the local level. More than likely, it's at the local government level. They take the land use actions for most issues. But if we need to get a plan amendment, so if a TSP, for example, says, I want to build, I'll go back to the roundabout intersection. It calls for a specific roundabout. Our traffic designers get in and look at that and say, roundabout's really not going to work here. We need to change that to a traffic signal. If the TSP says roundabout and you want to do a traffic signal, we have to amend that local plan for that kind of change. So that's something to factor, again, into your schedule. Some of the horror stories I've seen with this one is where a specific TSP maybe went a little too far in describing a specific solution. It described the right-of-way at 100 feet, and we needed 101 when we actually did the design. We had to go back to that local government and get a plan amendment process for 1 foot of right-of-way. So it's very critical to connect the dots as we move through the process from planning into that project delivery. Lack of community and local buy-in. Again, this is so critical with your local partners because the next item is local permits. All we need to do is just have one issue with one local government where they thought a project was going to work this way. All of a sudden now the design's not quite matching up with their expectations, but you need a local permit from them. Conditional use permit, a building permit, whatever that might be. If we don't have those good working relationships with them, getting through that process and the timeline for local permits can be very challenging. And then finally, I know on the project delivery side, having to go to the OTC to amend the STIP and try to add more money, add more time, that's what everybody loves to do, right? That's our number one goal, right? So if we don't do this right, we may have to come back and modify our own transportation plans and rules and requirements in front of the Transportation Commission. So again, that's not a very fun, specific spot to be in. We've had to do it occasionally. Sometimes it makes sense, but other times, why did we miss this? What happened between planning and project delivery where we could have avoided having to go back and amend a plan in front of the Transportation Commission? So all of those can have significant timeline challenges. I think one of the worst ones I ever saw was the issue down in Ashland. For those in Region 3, we relocated a rest area down in the Ashland area. Getting through the land use process was a 9 to 10 year delay for that project. Okay, increased project costs. So there's a lot of things that can affect the cost of a project from the planning process. And if we have some examples here around added time and cost increase, when we're talking about going through the legal land use process in front of the Department of Justice or even a legal case that we may have to go through, we're talking thousands and thousands of dollars of attorney's hours. For those that get the bills from the Department of Justice, yes, they're cheaper than maybe the private attorneys out there, but these are fairly expensive endeavors to go through. If we haven't planned for that, that is going to blow your budget. I think, Ken, you just talked about blowing budgets earlier. This is something we really need to watch for as we go forward. Sometimes if we don't have the connection between planning and project delivery, and we're still even staying on schedule, we may have to come up with some additional mitigations. So how we deal with property issues, access issues, circulation issues, and how that affects the overall transportation system. If our project hasn't complied specifically with what those plans are calling for, we may now need to put mitigations into our projects that we hadn't thought of. If you have to do that, that's added cost, that's added design work, added features we may have to buy to move it forward. And that local buy-in is just so critical. And then lastly is the relationships. Planning process, when we're working with many of our local government partners, I can tell you from doing this for about 20 years, many times when we're working with a city government or a county government to work on a new transportation plan, system plan, or a facility plan, we're coming in at a time where relationships are already stressed, strained, or damaged. So it takes a long time to build up that trust with our local government partners around what is the vision for their community and for their system and for their transportation network that provides their citizens their way of life and how they want to live and move around their community. So building that trust is so important. If we come back in and say we're going to do X and we end up doing Y, that just simply erodes that level of trust, that erodes our communication, our relationship pattern we have with those local government partners, and maintaining that will be so critical. We talked about if you need an action from a local government, if they're on board with what you're doing, it's likely going to go through faster. If we erode that relationship, very likely you're going to have challenges and issues, whether it's a formal action or just a building permit or even a conditional use permit. Local governments that like us, they like the project, they want that on the ground, they'll find a way to get things to happen fast. If they don't, they can hold you up and make things cost a whole lot more time and money. So really important to make sure those connections are understood and where those risk points are moving forward. So with that, I think I just saw the 5-minute warning, so that was my goal, to leave a few minutes for questions. So I went through that incredibly fast, but please, what kind of questions do you have between planning, project delivery, and risk?
You mentioned transportation system plan amendments that would have to go to the OTC. What's the timeline for that type of an effort that we should plan for if we have one of those?
Really good question. So if we're amending a plan that the Transportation Commission adopted, a facility plan, say like an interchange area management plan, you need to plan for up to about 3 to 6 months potentially to get that process through. So we need to work very closely with Department of Justice to make sure our plan has been updated appropriately. We have to coordinate with Department of Land Conservation because they own the statewide planning goals and requirements to make sure that everything is consistent. So after that all occurs, then the materials can come into the Transportation Commission. They have to hold a public hearing, even if it's a minor change. Sometimes we can do that in the same meetings, but oftentimes we have to meet public involvement requirements for a plan amendment. So you need to really be between 3 and 6 months at the short side.
So this question might be a little bit out of the box, but you talked about the TSPs having kind of goals and policies that are talking about fixing the statewide system through the data-driven process. My question has to do with maintenance of the facility. You know, oftentimes in project development, we have to work on IGAs with various local communities about who's going to maintain this facility. Recently, we're going through it with a transit provider right now, as who's going to maintain that transit facility as we go. Is there any way that the TSP can put anything around goals and policies that address maintenance in the future, or is that completely outside of the scope?
Franny, you always have the hard questions. There's some real challenges about how far we can go in the TSP policy framework. We actually have worked with a number of communities to identify maybe some of the features that we know are going to be more challenging for us to maintain, where we will have some policy language in a TSP or an RTP that talks about locals may need to maintain and operate some of those kind of systems. So it's not abnormal, but it's hard when you're more at the vision and really at that 10,000 foot level to know what all those details are. So it's more about just having a policy framework to help support that. And I think a lot of the TSPs do or can support that. Where it gets really tricky is when you come up with something and you haven't thought of it, and now it comes up late in the project delivery process. We're ready to go to bid, and we now talk to the local government saying, oh, by the way, we need to enter into this maintenance agreement with you. And they go, whoa, what's going on? We've been working for 2 years on this. Why are you coming out of the woodwork now? So the earlier we can flag that in the process, the better. And the planners may be able to help with this and see if we can tie that back to that policy framework. But we don't have a strong policy in all of our TSPs. I don't know if that answered that, but.
Having projects in TSPs is great. My comment is that the planners do an awful lot of work to get those TSPs put together. It takes a couple of years sometimes, and that's a great thing. And if it's a large improvement in an MPO, then we'll have to go through the NEPA piece. That takes a couple of years. Then we start to pursue projects. Well, during that multi-year process, the local, not always the local government, but the citizenry forgets that they supported that project in the beginning. And so there's this reiteration of this is what you wanted to build 4 years ago. You said this was a great thing. So if there were a way to consolidate processes or speed them up, that would be very helpful for being able to get projects on the ground more quickly.
Molly, I 110% agree. You and I lived through a little thing maybe called the West Eugene Parkway, a few other challenging projects. When you're dealing with local governments that are more, and specific projects at the local level that are controversial, all it takes is a slight change in the city council, and they don't care what their predecessors said they wanted to do. It's up to them. Obviously, the best way is when we have those kind of controversial projects, we have a funding mechanism right there ready to go. But that's the reality of where we don't have it yet. We have a number of projects ready to go in a TSP with no money to support them, so we could be looking 5, 10, 15, 20 years out. So we also need to be careful about how much pre-work do we do in NEPA, for example. It doesn't do any good to have entire NEPA record decision or a FONSI issued, and then we end up waiting another 15 years before construction money. We're gonna have to go back and redo it again. So trying to align priorities out of the system plan into a strategic investment portfolio at the state and with our local government partners would maybe help streamline that a little bit better so we know what are the real priorities we need to be working on, and when they do happen, we can keep that momentum moving forward because once you lose it, it's really hard to get it back. And again, we could talk about all the massive failures that I've seen around project delivery and planning over controversial projects, but it's a big risk.
For one more question?
Can you talk about facility plans a little bit more? Can you explain that a little further?
Sure. So a facility plan is a very specific, detailed plan for an ODOT facility or a portion of an ODOT facility. It's different than a transportation system plan. That's done at a community-wide level. So a facility plan is going to be very targeted to a segment of usually an ODOT highway. So the classic ones we see are interchange area management plans, where we'll look at an interchange to figure out what's the long-term need, what are the kind of solutions we need for traffic, for land use, for access management, for circulation, for alternative modes. And we put together a specific plan, working very closely with hopefully our tech centers on the design concepts, where we can get that support to say, here's the kind of solution we think we need to do at that particular interchange so we can plan for that. That's important because we can get out and protect right-of-way during the development review phase, where local governments are going to try to build up around an interchange. That way we can make sure we get setbacks, other kind of requirements. We can even get the local governments to sometimes make investments to help protect those future investments, whether that's putting local infrastructure in, local roadways, disconnecting roadways perhaps. We can get to those kind of agreements in a facility plan. So think about the granularity. The OTP, the policy plans are way up here. The transportation plans bring it down about halfway. Facility plans is getting about as close as you can to what we call real project planning, more of the on the ground, what's the details of what you want to build and how you want to build it. Does that help?
Okay, Erik, thank you so much. Really appreciate your information.